Good morning, everyone. My name is Gina Grandy, and I am the editor of Case Research Journal. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and happy International Women's Day. This is the third of a series of webinars that we are running on writing cases and specifically featuring award-winning cases, Tate Award winners, getting them to talk about their experience with their case, what makes for an award-winning case. And we've had two already. This morning, I am joined by Colleen Sharen. I have a list of questions for our conversation, but we will also monitor your questions in the chat, also in the Q&A chat. So if you have questions along the way, please post them. I will either insert them in our conversation as we go, or as we get towards the latter part of our conversation, look to some of them. So as I said, I'm joined today by Colleen Sharen, who is an associate professor of management and org studies at Brescia University College at Western University in London, Ontario. Colleen has a BA in political science from Wilfrid Laurier University, an MBA from Ivey School of Business at Western University, a diploma in applied social research from Georgian College, and is completing her ED at University of Calgary. Colleen has published a long list of cases through Case Research Journal and Ivey Publishing. She's a member of Case Research Journal's editorial board. She received the Tate Award in 2017 for the best case published in CRJ in 2016, and that's the case we're going to be featuring today. And Colleen has also received the Best Case Award at the Administrative Sciences Association of Canada annual meeting in 2013, and has received Outstanding Reviewer Awards for CRJ and ASAC. Colleen is a passionate case writer and teacher, always looking for new ways to enhance students' learning through cases. Welcome, Colleen, and thank you for agreeing to join us today.
Thank you. It's going to be fun.
It will be fun. This case that we're featuring today is not only an award-winning case, it was a case that was published in the special issue in Women's Leadership that Cynthia Ingalls and I co-edited in 2016. So it's volume 36, issue 4, for those of you who might want to look for a case that you know will have a woman protagonist. And I think it's particularly fitting, Colleen, that we're talking about this case today on this day, International Women's Day. It's a fitting case to both celebrate women leaders and women case authors, but also to remind us of the responsibility we have as educators to move the bar on redressing gender disadvantage. With that introduction, let's get started in our conversation. Colleen, to give context for those who may be with us this morning who perhaps haven't read the case or viewed the case, which you can tell us a little more about, can you give us a brief synopsis of the case and the focus of the instructor's manual?
Okay, so the case is about Chris Green, who's the CEO of Family Care Canada. Family Care Canada is a chapter-based nonprofit organization devoted to improving the quality of life for Canadian families. Every year for 22 years, Family Care Canada has run a domestic violence campaign designed to educate and inform the general public about domestic violence and its consequences. So the agency had decided at this point that the campaign was not very fresh and that it needed some shaking up in order to better reach and be relevant to the millennial generation. So they worked with their agency and came up with a really groundbreaking campaign. The problem was it was controversial. And one of the chapters was very concerned about how this particular campaign might re-victimize the victims of domestic violence. So the case itself is about a decision, but the decision is facilitated by the leader, Chris Green. And so the content of the video is designed to give you familiarity with Chris Green's leadership style and approach and the way that Chris thinks about leadership. The purpose of the case is to help students really get through the idea that their implicit beliefs and biases might not always align with their explicit beliefs and biases about men and women and about race in terms of leadership. And so the idea was to give a real contextual issue that somebody was leading through in the case. And in the video, have students assess that leader. And typically what we find, although it's not always the case, that students tend to evaluate the male leader as stronger than the female leader, and the white leader as stronger than the Black leader.
Thanks, Colleen. It is an absolutely fascinating case, and you touched on the point of the video. So this is what I might refer to as a hybrid video and written case. And we haven't published many of them in CRJ. We've published a few, but as I said, it's a hybrid. So the written narrative plays a role, but there is the video as well. Videos, I should say. Tell us about the relationship between the written case and the videos, and why you set it up this way.
So the written case contains the context of the decision being made. It contains all of the information that a student would need to know to be able to make that decision. And it provides the context for the evaluation of the leader. The videos, I really feel like you can't express who a person is through written description. There's too many ways that the writer's bias interferes with it. So the purpose of the videos was to give the students a chance to really connect with the protagonist. And there are 4 different videos, and each of the videos portrays the protagonist slightly differently in terms of their personal identity, male or female, Black or white. And so the idea was you get to see that leader as they present themselves, and then assess that leader based on your own beliefs about the leader. And the idea was that it would get rid of this interface of the written description, the author kind of filtering how they saw that particular leader.
And I love in the written narrative as well, you kind of take I'm going to call it if such a thing exists, a gender neutral name, or perhaps gender question, I don't know, right? So as a way to, I know every student will be assigned to one of the 4 videos, so that the name, doesn't we don't attach a gender necessarily to the name, which I think is very neat.
It's very hard to do, by the way.
Yeah.
The first 2 or 3 times I kept coming up with gendered pronouns all through the manuscript. So the challenge is, it was very difficult not to put he and she, his or her throughout the case. And I think in some ways it made, the case has some awkward phrasing because I had to stay away from those gendered pronouns.
Colleen, what led you to this idea? So the organization, but I'm going to say more importantly, the focus on women in leadership and the video aspect, around the implicit bias and intersectionality.
At the time that I was writing this, I had I was teaching a women in leadership course for a leadership studies degree. And one of the interesting things was that the students consistently projected bias onto other people, but insisted that they themselves were not biased. And I'd been playing around with that idea for a couple of years, trying to figure out how do I help them see that we're all biased. And there's an implicit associations test that Harvard has that I tried, but they saw that as kind of artificial and fake. So what they did was, what I was looking for was a way to have them really experience their own biases by having them make their own assessment.
Colleen, tell us a little bit then about the mechanic side. So tell us about the tech part in developing case. ensuring the quality of production, and even the length of the videos, right? Because I know you were quite strategic even in the length of the video. So tell us about kind of that part of it. Was it new to you? Did you draw on, I will say, professional services? Because I know that there are a lot of people out there who, we know that students want more technology-based cases. So tell us about your experiences.
So let me start out by saying that for 10 years prior to becoming a professor, I worked as a marketing director at a large firm. And so I have worked with advertising production firms. I've worked with ad agencies. So I had some knowledge about how to work with a video production company. The second thing is I applied for an internal grant. At the time, Brescia had donors grant. So each donor gave $1,000 in the total pool. They decided together who they were going to give it to. And that year I applied for it and they gave it to me. And so I had a little bundle of cash that I could go outside the university to get a professional videographer. This particular producer has a lot of social media savvy, and I've worked with him before. So one of the things you want to do is assess what technical skills you have within your institution. Some institutions have really good video production services internally. You don't need to go external. So I found the funding. I had worked with this person. We spent a lot of time up front working out all of the details to make sure that the videos were as close as possible. The other thing I did was a little bit of research into how students use video from a pedagogical point of view. So we know that after 5 minutes, you lose about 90% of your student audience. So we kind of strategically focused in on 5 minutes worth of information. So what we did was we did a full hour video interview with the actual protagonist, Chris Green. And once we finished that video and cut it down to the key pieces we wanted, we then matched that for the other 3 videos. So it does take a lot of careful planning and a lot of thought to working with the technology. So this isn't dashing off a case. You have to spend a lot more time on it.
Well, and I, one thing I will say though is that time paid off, right? And here you are with, it being recognized as the Tate Award winning case, but also a remarkable case. And, there's so many things unique about this case. So not only the video component, it features if I recall correctly, the real protagonist was a woman, although you use the case in a particular way. But one of the things for me, I'll say this, as you know, there are very few cases with women protagonists, and with CRJ, we've had the special issue where your case was featured. We recently had one on women entrepreneurs, and we see far more initiatives happening now to highlight more women. But one of the things that we still see very little is considerations of intersectionality. And, one of the things that your case did was pull that out in addition to the gender considerations. And you've set it up as optional, recognizing that an instructor may not necessarily have the comfort level. But why was that important to you? So why build that in? Because you could have left it just at the gender aspect and it would have been a fantastic case.
So let me start out by saying that my initial intent was to cover gender. And then the actual Chris Green happens to be an African Canadian woman. And she is just one of the most amazing leaders I've ever met. And when I asked her to do it, she jumped at it. So what happened was the first, in the initial submission, I kind of talked about it a little bit, but didn't do much with it. And one of the reviewers called me out on it, and legitimately so. And I will say one of the reasons that I did not in the first round, the first submission, really deal with it much is because I felt as a cisgendered white woman, I had no business commenting on issues around race. And what got me more comfortable with it, aside from a kick in the pants from the reviewer, was a colleague of mine in the Ed.D program at University of Calgary, who is an African Canadian woman, told me in a class discussion once. I said, hey, I don't want to be accused of appropriation. I don't want to be speaking for somebody else. I feel really uncomfortable doing that. And she said to me, we need allies. And when I try to tell students this as a Black woman, they think I have an axe to grind. When you tell somebody as a white woman, you're perceived as being unbiased, which is absolutely ludicrous. But when she said that, it made me feel so much better about trying to talk about issues of race in terms of pedagogy. So it was those two things that really, and honestly, in my mind, we were way past race. And I should have recognized that we're not way past race. And some of the stories I've heard from colleagues since then have really convinced me that we're not even, we're not anywhere near there. But at the time, I didn't understand that. So it took me a while to get my head wrapped around dealing with the intersectionality piece. And now I recognize that if I don't do it, I'm doing my students a disservice, especially the BIPOC people of color in my class.
Colleen, what I also love about that is that notion of how, we as case writers, when it works best, we are both the learner as well as part of the learning for others. And, how fortunate are we to have jobs whereby we can engage in and stretch in that way. But I also think that it speaks to you as a case writer, always wanting to stretch yourself, right? And the willingness to be able to put yourself out there, because I think that comes through in your cases, but also in your instructor's manual, right? That notion of being able to empathize with who other instructors are, so that it is a learning process for not only the students, but those who are engaging in that process. Colleen, the topics in the instructor's manual, not surprising, maybe challenging and unsettling for students. And I will say also perhaps for the reviewers of your case, but even, and there are lessons in there when we think about writing cases and who we're writing cases for. We often are writing, we have in our heads for the students, but the students don't typically even get to see your cases unless we get it past the reviewers. So tell us about some of the challenges you faced through the review process and how you overcame that to publish this award-winning case. And I asked that question because, of course, I was the editor who, at that time, I was the special issue editor that was working with you in the management of the review process. So tell us about that experience.
Well, I got to tell you, I got the reviews back and opened them up. And like often when we get reviews and open them up, our hearts sank. But one of the reasons my heart sank was that each of the reviews had a very, very different take on the case. One review was, hey, it's almost ready to publish. One review was, it needs a little work. A fair rewrite here, but it's okay. And one was just, basically an almost close to reject this thing. And it paralyzed me to the point where I just put it away and sat on it for 4 months until I got an email from your friendly neighborhood special issue editor saying, okay, call me, we need to talk. So one of the lessons I learned from that process about reviewing is reviews can be paralyzing, especially when they're all over the place and you don't really know what to do. And so having a conversation with the editor, I learned, is one way to kind of manage through some of that. I don't know how to handle this. So now whenever I submit something and I get reviews back that are confusing to me, I reach out to the editor and I have a conversation. The second thing that I learned about the reviewing process is that there's useful stuff in there if you can get past your own emotions and defensiveness. So I think the case is a much better case because the reviewers pushed me to go in certain kinds of places. In particular, the reviewers pushed me to go to places to help the instructor, in particular, manage a socially contentious issue in the classroom. So there's a whole section in the instructor's manual around the idea of how do I handle sensitive issues? Like what are some of the tools I can use? So, and that was there at the request of one of the reviewers. So those were important things. The other thing I learned is sometimes reviewers, may be right, but there's nothing you can do about it. So for example, the videos had already been shot. I needed the video shot to do the review. There was some concern that the videos didn't really match up particularly well, so that they weren't fair comparisons, which, is, I think there's a certain degree of truth to that. But the problem was I had already spent the money and had no more money to spend. And there was no way to recut the videos to resolve that problem. So we just had to live with the problem. This kind of work is that in order to get it reviewed, you have to have the final product, but reshooting may not be possible.
And Colleen, I remember, there's a couple of things in there, you've talked about earlier how important it is to plan, which you did, especially in video cases. But also I remember those comments, and I remember, and I'm going to share, and you can correct me if my memory is off on this, but I'm going to share this because I think the people joining us, it'll help them contextualize. So, the scripts were the same. You tried as much as possible to kind of keep even their physicality similar, but it was in the physicality where we saw some subtle differences. Like, for example, I remember how, like, even how their legs were, right? So there were kind of these subtle differences, like someone had their legs open, someone had their closed, someone used far more gestures than someone else, and how they had their hands. There was even slight differences when you looked closely, the distance between the protagonist and the person interviewing. Again, all subtle. And this is where you say sometimes, the reviewers can be right. It was a great review for them to actually pick up on those subtle differences, because and I remember in your how you addressed that was you acknowledged it. Right? You acknowledged it, and then you grounded it also in research. But I think what it also did, it made it a stronger instructor's note, because I think other instructors who might look at it, especially ones who might have a discomfort with the topic or actually disagree with the premise, to me, it would have become for them a way to dismiss the validity of what you were doing. And so you are right about sometimes kind of turning around that review, and sometimes that review, which may not seem to be on the same page, there's something in that actually can make your case much stronger, and your teaching note much stronger. So really, that's to you to be able, in really having the strength to see it in that way. Colleen, tell us about your experience teaching this case and the class discussions and reflections. So no doubt you've used this several times now. What have been your experiences?
I've actually only been able to use it once, because right after that, somebody else started teaching the course that this case was designed for. What is interesting is this was an undergraduate class. And so there is some research that suggests that undergraduates and graduates see gender quite differently. And the interesting part is one would think the undergraduates would be more comfortable with gender than the graduates. It's just the reverse. So there was a study done at a large business school recently. It hasn't been published, but I've seen the data. And the grad students are more likely to report lack of gender bias than the undergrads. So I don't know, I can't even hypothesize about that, but what I do know is that it's pretty eye-opening for students. The conversation usually starts out with some kind of assumption around the fact that men are the default leaders and those kinds of things, and slowly shifts into kind of an aha moment when you reveal the data. And it's the data reveal that they kind of go, oh, and I was in group A or I was in group B. So I saw the male or I saw the female. My classes aren't big enough to run all 4 of them. So I usually only run 2. And it's very interesting because the fact that they have bias is what shocks the students. And so then it becomes about processing the fact that they have bias. And usually the whole class is around this idea that, wow, I thought I wasn't biased at all, but I am. And that's really where, and that's the point of the case.
And this, I know you talk about this case, it's an ideal case for women in leadership course, but also quite fitting for organizational behavior, human resources, even a diversity class. So there's lots of opportunities in regards to where do we fit this case in. Colleen, if you were to redo the case in the IM, what, if anything, would you do differently?
I would. So the way that we shot the videos was we shot the initial interview in the morning, translated it, and then shot the other 3 videos in the afternoon. What I would do is I would shoot the initial, the actual protagonist on day 1, have a 2-day break in between, and then shoot the other 3 the 3rd day. Primarily because the actors who were playing those roles did not have a lot of time to learn their lines. And we did not have a lot of time to study the body positions and body language and even the tone of voice that the protagonist was using. And so what I would do is I would make the scripts, but also the videos available to the actors, give them a couple days to prepare and then come in and shoot. It would cost a little bit more, but I think the videos themselves would be much more consistent with each other. I think that would be one thing. And I think the other thing would be for myself, to really get more comfortable and familiar with questions of intersectionality and race. I still think that there was more that I could have done with that in the instructor's manual.
Thank you. Yeah, Colleen, there's a question there, and I'm going to ask it around because it links to sort of the mechanics to a certain way. Is there an argument for an early review of the script storyboard before shooting?
Yes and no. So yes, if there was an actual script, but we had done this as an interview. So I had set up about 10 questions, and then we interviewed the protagonist and caught that on video. So it wasn't formally scripted, but if you were doing kind of a storyboarded actual acting exercise, I would absolutely suggest that working with an editor early on and getting that preliminary review makes sense. In my case, it wouldn't have worked particularly well because we still would have already shot her stuff. And then we get into challenges around coming back later and shooting in the same physical space. So it worked out okay, but I think that that's a really good question. And I think in certain circumstances, it really makes a lot of sense.
Colleen, you teach women in leadership. This is your wheelhouse. Even if you say, okay, on the intersectionality side, you still have kind of your own, work that you want to do to advance your understanding. But not everyone fits there. So fair enough if someone's teaching a women in leadership class, but you and I have had lots of conversations in the past about, well, we need to go beyond, right? A women in leadership class. We need to be able to get our men and women, or regardless of gender, our colleagues talking about these issues in the classroom. So what advice do you have for other instructors who may not feel equipped to cover gender and or intersectionality in their classes?
I think it's being open to the idea of even looking for cases that feature female protagonists or people of color in their cases. And that representation is really crucial, just knowing that there are people in your sector or your industry. So if you're in IT, just knowing that there are other women or other people of color in IT makes a difference. So that's one small way to start. You don't have to have a big discussion about it. But for example, if you teach IT, maybe race and gender as part of the profession is a thing because of the whole bro culture in IT. And you're not teaching somebody how to code, but you are teaching somebody how to be an IT manager, and managing people issues is a big part of what we do. So maybe you're not ready to have the conversation yet, but you can bring in guest speakers who are not the traditional straight white guy as a way to start that conversation.
I believe as well, Colleen, in that the special issue where your case was published, Cynthia Ingalls and I had written an article, and part of what we had included in that was a sample script as well. Now it was specific to gender, so it didn't cover the intersectionality, but a script that we encouraged other authors, case writers, to kind of have that there that they could use in their instructors' manuals as well. And maybe we should be thinking about a similar type of thing around intersectionality, just as that starting point for those conversations. We have a couple of questions that I'm going to go to, Colleen. Someone asked, can you give a sense of the budget provided for the video portion of the case? I believe you had made reference to, you had $1,000 grant, and was that sufficient to cover it?
No, the way the grant was collected is each donor gave $1,000. It was a $13,000 grant. I used about 12 of it. And that's the difference between, going internal at the university and going to a professional. We also had some challenges because our protagonist was based in Toronto, not in London. So we went to her to film. So there was a bunch of things going on that increased our cost. You can do it for far less than that if you use your internal staff. And depending on the university, some have really highly professional video production facilities and others not so much. So you kind of have to figure out whether or not you want to do it that way. Because I had worked with this video production firm before and really knew the director really well, I chose to work with him even though he was going to cost me more money because I really trusted him. And that is one of the biggies in doing this kind of work, is that you have to have a good relationship with your tech people.
Thank you. And I might add as well that, and you talked about the notion of, you kind of went sort of higher end because you had the relationship. I mean, I know from some of my own experience with some of the smaller local firms that my guess is you probably could also do it for about half that. But I also think that, again, you'd have to be, unless people have that experience as the case writer, you'd almost have to be a director as well, right? So you have to know what you're looking for in that. So the quality can be as sharp as what you did, but I also think that it will mean, as case writer, you have to be very clear about what you're looking for, because once you shoot it and you go back and ask for those clips, you have to be pretty clear about what you want, because they won't have the experience, at least the first time around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we have another question here in the chat. Thank you for your overview of the case study and the process you journeyed through to publish it. Love the reference to the importance of allyship. Congratulations. Having not seen the instructor's manual, and there's several questions in here, is pre-work for the class provided? My assumption is that there is pre-work. Is unconscious bias information also provided? And there are a couple of others, but let's go with that one first.
Okay, so the case does provide for pre-work. The students, in fact, there's a whole section in the teaching approach about student perception, or student preparation. So the students have to prepare the case, and then they're sent to a video. They view one of 2 or one of 4 videos, depending on what you've done. And there's a 7-question evaluation that the students do of that leader. So that's the student preparation. And remind me, the second question was student preparation and?
That is there unconscious bias information also provided?
There is a section on unconscious bias in the linkage to theory and frameworks section. It isn't in depth, but I do provide some resources for you to read. Like the whole theory section is about 1.5 pages long. But there are some references that you can use if you want to get deeper into unconscious bias.
Colleen, there's another question there that talks about if you've used this case in the virtual environment. I know you haven't because you haven't taught that class, but do you have any thoughts on how you'd set up this class in the virtual environment and what that might look like, or would it be different?
So, I mean, there's 2 virtual environments. One is synchronous and the other one is asynchronous. So I could imagine with the asynchronous environment, having the students do the case, kind of write up a couple of answers, and then review the data, like do the ranking. And then a couple of days later, you post the ranking and ask the students to reflect in their discussion forums on what they think the ranking, what they think the data means. So that could definitely be one way to do it asynchronously. I would definitely, with the synchronous environment, have them do their analysis of the decision plus their review in advance, and then synchronously unpack their evaluations of the leader. You could do that in about 90 minutes in a synchronous class. It's a little tougher to deal, in my opinion, to deal with kind of emotional issues through Zoom. There's something about the mediation of that makes it more difficult. So I think this would be harder to do online, but it's not impossible. I think it's very doable.
And there may be ways to do debriefing in smaller groups as well, right, Colleen, as a way rather than kind of that larger classroom. This is also a great reminder to me as well, linked to this question, that since we've switched to a remote context for most of our classes, last year, late in the year, we've now started to ask CRJ case writers to include a section in their instructor's manual around teaching the case in a remote context. So because we anticipate moving forward that once we get out of COVID, so to speak, that we will see more and more of the asynchronous and synchronous delivery in a remote context of our cases. So that's something that I will say to everyone who's listening today to keep an eye out for as you start looking for our new cases that we're publishing. Colleen, you're an incredibly active case writer. My sense is that you focus a lot on women protagonists, entrepreneurial firms with women protagonists, and also nonprofits. Is this an intentional strategy? And if so, what is your favorite type of case to write and why?
So let's start out with the intentional strategy question. When I first started writing cases, it was basically anybody who agreed to have a case written about them. And one of the things we know about women's networks versus men's networks is women's networks have more women in them. And so what was happening was, through my personal network, people were saying, oh yeah, I know somebody, she'll have a case written about her. So it started out kind of accidentally. But as I started to grow in my own practice of case writing, but also in my understanding of pedagogy and women in pedagogy, I realized that there weren't a lot of cases about women. And so what started out as an accident resulted in a strategy. So in terms of writing the cases, and choosing what cases to write and what are my favorite cases, I get attracted by ideas. So my favorite cases happen to be whatever turns my crank. And I know this sounds weird, but I get interested in certain things. Like I wrote a case with a colleague recently on a nonprofit called Rise Asset Development, which is a social enterprise. And I've been following social enterprise for about 10 years now. And I've come to my own personal belief, which is I'm not sure it makes sense. And that's just a personal philosophical belief. So when I ran across this opportunity to write this case, that's why I wrote it, because the underlying assumption is social enterprise is what's going to save nonprofits. And I'm completely convinced that it is not going to save nonprofits, that it has a certain appropriate role, but it is not the way that we're going to get out of funding nonprofits through donors and government. So for me personally, what excites me is the ideas. And then I start to build a case around the ideas when I find the right case writing opportunity.
Great, thanks. I know we have Jane joining us this morning, and Jane just recently sent an email asking about, asking about in our schools, do we have mentorship programs to develop case writers, in particular student case writers and that type of thing? And that's at the, I raise that because I think, Jane, this will also link to some of the questions you've raised outside of our forum today. Colleen, I know you often write with students as co-authors. How have you ensured a successful collaboration with student co-authors?
So I've written with student co-authors, and I've written with new case writers as well. So I've written a case with a professor from Brescia who's a sociologist, and I've written a case with a professor from Fanshawe who's an English lit professor. And as well as with undergraduate students. And I would say in all of those cases, familiarizing your co-author with the constraints of the genre and the purpose of the genre is crucial to success. Letting them own part of the case or part of the instructor's manual so they feel personal ownership, and treating it as a coaching opportunity rather than kind of just a directive opportunity. So coaching them through thinking about these kinds of things. With my faculty colleagues who have not written cases before from disciplines that don't normally do cases, the challenge is having them think differently about the pedagogy. And so working with them to think about how an instructor might unpack this and teach this is crucial. Working with the students, they're not experienced teachers, but I usually tend to choose my own students. So they're experienced users of cases from the student perspective. So having them take that point of view and then work through the process of writing a case in an instructor's manual is really, really the key here. So it takes a lot more time, quite frankly. And sometimes the quality of the case is a little bit uneven because you can often have two different authors' voices kind of intermingled throughout the whole thing. But my experience has been, excuse me, my experience has been if you have the patience and you're in it as a coach, you can be incredibly successful.
Thanks, Colleen. I mean, we have about 10 minutes or so left here, and I just want to encourage everyone that if you have questions, please continue to put them in the chat. I have a few other questions for you as well, Colleen. I'm just going to read the comment that Jane has noted. Thanks for the feedback regarding collaboration with students as a coaching opportunity. Agreed, thinking about pedagogy of the case and how the case will apply theory in the IM is important, and we'll take time to coach students to think this way. Thank you very much. There was an earlier comment as well that I want to share in case we missed it, Colleen, saying this was earlier, Colleen, when you were talking about including the intersectionality aspect into the IM where you had that discomfort. Colleen, kudos to you heeding the advice. As a Black woman in the academy, your colleagues' advice resonates, and it is refreshing to hear that you moved forward in your allyship to tell the story. So I wanted to make sure we shared that as well. Colleen, tell us about what's in your pipeline right now on cases. And I know that you are trying to finish up you will finish up your Ed.D. Thesis. But I also know, because of our conversation, there's always 2 or 3 at least working in Colleen's head partway through or planning forward. So kind of what's in your case writing pipeline right now?
Well, I'm working on a case for CRJ's upcoming special issue on secondary source cases. And that case is about the We Charity scandal. One of the nice things about the We Charity scandal is there's all kinds of lovely evidence in House of Commons committee hearings that is providing the foundation for this case. It is a very challenging case to write because it's such a complex set of issues that have morphed over time, from being kind of a lobbying conflict of interest situation to being a much broader inquiry into the way that We Charity operates. So I'm working with a student research assistant who I think will end up being co-author on the case. I'm not 100% certain yet. The challenges of working on a case with secondary data, it's actually a lot more work, to be quite frank. I'm learning that the hard way. But the case itself is a really interesting case because it really looks at not so much legality around transparency and accountability for a nonprofit, or in this case, a charitable organization, but also consumer or donor or taxpayer perceptions of the accountability and transparency. So that's one that I have, that I'm working on currently. I've got a couple of other ideas for cases that I haven't moved forward yet. One is a podcast case. So not a case about podcasting, but a case that is delivered through the media of podcasting. I want to tackle that one, but I think I'm going to wait until after the dissertation is completed.
Colleen, we have a couple of questions there, and one is about really the mechanics of posting the videos for your case for the review process, and then the publication. So, and really, that's still something as a body, I'll say case research journal, still needs to kind of figure out to a certain extent, because we get so few of them, right? So tell us a little about what you did and kind of where they are now.
So I initially posted the cases on Vimeo in a private, and they were set up to be private. So only the reviewers could review the cases. I'm not sure where when we moved them somewhere, but they're sitting somewhere either on YouTube or Vimeo, and there's a link to them that is available through Case Research Journal.
And it is Vimeo. It's still on Vimeo. Yeah.
Okay. And the reason I chose Vimeo was, at the time, you could not have a private video on YouTube. And so I had to use Vimeo. Now, there's a couple of technical things to keep in mind, and I don't know how YouTube works, but at the time, Vimeo, there was a limited amount of upload you could do. And so I had to actually buy a premium membership to upload all 4 videos. I think it was like 60 or $100. What I would say is it's a good hack as a workaround, but ideally, eventually, if we had more cases, it would be best to have some kind of case research journal platform that was set up specifically for this purpose.
I agree. Colleen, two related questions to that. One is in the notion of concerns about people stealing the content. I mean, what I might argue, and you can comment on this, are 2 things. One is you have to have the link from the instructor's manual, and typically for the students, you send them to one. But I would also say that your case, again, that hybrid component, because the videos actually are meaningless without the actual case. And one might argue that that's in one way a sort of protection as it relates specifically to your case. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that, in the sense that the case isn't complete unless you know the decision that was being discussed. That said, I kind of have a different approach. you know, the whole idea of stealing something, if somebody wants to try and use, like, this is not the official status of anybody, but if somebody, from my point of view as the author, if somebody wants to try and use that without using the case, bless you. If that's what you want to do, I'm not sure you will get the same value out of it, but there are institutions where resources are really thin on the ground. And I'm certainly not going to condemn anybody for wanting to try and find a way to manage their students' expenses. So, you know, as long as somebody's learning something from it, that's why I write cases.
Thanks, Colleen. We have a couple questions, but I'm going to ask, Karen, the question you've written, does that distribution also work with all the CRJ's publishing outlets? Karen, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that one, so I'm wondering if you can elaborate. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go to Rima's question, which is, how do you see case studies not only in pedagogy, but also in advocating or advocacy for policy making, Colleen?
Wow. I think that they have an informal impact. So, for example, I wrote a Journal of Management Education paper a while ago looking at the number of female protagonists in cases. And in this case, we chose the Ivy database for various reasons. And we were able to use that to have a conversation with Ivy Publishing about improving the number of female protagonists. And they were very open to that. So I think that you can certainly use this kind of research for advocacy for policy change within your organization. And another example of that would be, I just reviewed a paper that was looking at the number of people of color represented in cases. There were some methodological challenges with that one, but essentially I think it's the same point, which is that marginalized people, or people who are marginalized by others, are not represented well in our standard curriculum. And I think you can definitely use that for internal policy making. And there's a lot of evidence that demonstrates it's important.
Great. Thanks, Colleen. And just to clarify Karen's question in regards to, so the access to the videos, you know, outside of CRJ, are they available? So if you purchase the case through Harvard, and absolutely, yes. So the link is in the instructor's manual, and that link works regardless of how you access the case. Which is actually quite easy, and really that's a function also of Colleen's willingness to play, I'm going to say, when we were doing the case. Colleen, we have a couple minutes left, and I have a couple questions for you, but I do want to put a call out to those with us today that if you have questions for Colleen about the case or other cases, this is really your chance to ask them, because we're getting close on time here. Colleen, my question for you is, as you reflect on the process of writing and publishing this case, and as an award-winning case, what 2 to 4 aspects of this case or instructor's manual process would you say contribute to it being a winning case?
The first thing is that it dealt with subject matter that was a pretty large gap in the case catalogs of all of the major publishers, which is kind of women in leadership / intersectionality in leadership. The second was that using the innovative hybrid written case video, I think distinguished it from a lot of other cases. And then finally, I think the peer review process, as painful as it was, I think it really did make a difference in terms of the quality, especially of the instructor's manual, which made it more usable for instructors, and I think hopefully gave them more confidence to adopt the case.
Yeah, great points. And I having, you know, the audience we have here today, is probably worth sharing with them the process of determining those award-winning cases. So, and I say this because While I was an associate editor and the special issue editor at the time, I wasn't the editor, but it's, I think it's very clear to say that this was one of my favorite cases. It is a topic that is near and dear to my own heart, but actually as editor, I don't make those decisions. So as editor and associate editors, we are often involved in putting forward nominations of cases that go to the larger NACRA board, where there is an independent committee that looks at them to make that decision. And I think that's important to note because, yes, it's one of my favorite cases and really important, but that process of selecting the best case for the year is actually taken out of my hands and it goes to an independent body. And so I think that also speaks to the wider audience and seeing that value in your case, Colleen. We have one other question here, and this will probably be our last. Would you recommend using video with written text as an approach to developing cases? Or do you think it is considerably more challenging to do so? I really like the idea, but wonder about the challenges of doing this effectively.
It's hard. I think it's rewarding though, because one of the things that the text-based case does is it strips out a lot of the humanity away from the case. These are real people with real life experiences and real life consequences if a case goes, if the situation goes south on them. And I think having video makes those things become all the more real to students. I think that it increases student engagement to have some kind of interactive, either video or audio component. I think it's definitely well worth it. It is harder. And I would say that it is harder and requires more planning. If you were going to do it, I would suggest you reach out to either the special issue editor or the editor and kind of give them the heads up what you're doing ahead of time. They may have suggestions for you. And it certainly takes some planning and some confidence that you can pull it off. And I would encourage you to reach out to a co-author, maybe somebody who's already got experience in the video world to help you with the planning and development process.
And I'm going to add to that, Colleen, as well. You talk about your first one. I mean, quite frankly, I'm sure if you were to do the next one, not that it would be easy, but it would be easier, right? Because you would be thinking about those aspects you hadn't in the time before. So I think that's also important to keep in mind as well. But I would argue, the first time anyone publishes in CRJ can be a painful experience as well. You learn tons from it. And the next time around, it isn't quite so tough as well. And I think you're right that our students want a different level of engagement with their cases, and you're far more likely to get them more engaged, especially I think in a remote context with some aspect of a video component. Colleen, I want to thank you for being here today on International Women's Day. And if you didn't catch it when you signed on, the case is The Balancing Act, Making Tough Decisions. So I encourage you all to look to one of our distributors to look at the case and think about using it in your classes, and perhaps take on the challenge today, given it is International Women's Day, that actually, regardless of your gender as an instructor, regardless of where you believe your expertise is, but actually starting to look for a case that has a woman protagonist and or has some gender intersectionality components in the instructor's manual, regardless of the discipline. So Colleen, I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for being here today. We have a webinar that's coming up, again, featuring a Tate Award-winning case on April the 12th. Eric Delansky and the Tate Award winner Karen Boroff will be here to talk about her experiences in writing an award-winning case. And I want to add this last note before we go. A wonderful way to kick off International Women's Day, I would agree. And someone, Meredith, talking about your case is one of her favorite cases to use in her leadership classes. Thanks so much for all of your amazing work. So what a wonderful way to start International Women's Day. Thank you, Colleen, and thank you everyone for joining us today.